Okay, well, welcome to our lecture today in our lecture series sponsored by the James Van Houston Center for Humanity and Common Good. I'm Jens Zimmerman, the director, and today we're very, very pleased to have Dr. Eleanor McLaughlin with us. She holds a PhD from the University of Oxford and a master's degree from the University of Geneva. She's written, her most recent book is titled Unconscious Christianity in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Late Theology, Encounters with the Unknown Christ. And she's also a chapter, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Death of God Theologians, in a book called Engaging Bonhoeffer, The Impact and Influence of Bonhoeffer's Life and Thought, and various other writings. I invited Dr. McLaughlin because she's also researched on the topic of the person and disability studies, a great interest of hers. And I've heard her speak on this a number of times. And that's the reason that she's invited today to speak to us on the integrity of the human person. So thank you very much, Ellie, for coming and for being virtually present. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jens. Thank you for your invitation and for this opportunity to speak to so many people in so many different locations. I'm going to share my screen so that we can follow along both visually and on audio, as it were. So let me do that. I'm going to start my slides from the beginning. Sorry, it was working a moment ago. Unfortunately, the Zoom toolbar is right at the top of my screen and is not allowing me to click slideshow. Let me stop sharing and try sharing again, and hopefully this time it will work. Okay, is that working for everyone? Okay, I've seen a thumbs up, I'm going to go. So today I'd like to talk about the person and disability and really focus in on a question around the integrity of the human person, both people with and without disabilities, but taking the lens of a disability perspective to help us think through these questions. So I wanted to start off with a general introduction to disability theology, because of course, although many people may have come across this discipline already, it's somewhat of a younger sibling, as it were, in the realm of theology. So if we wanted to have a nutshell definition of disability theology, we would say that it is theology by, for, and including people with disabilities. It's a theology that seeks to liberate people, both people with and without disabilities, from oppressive structures that are caused by ableism. So there's a lot of liberation theology that's written from a disability perspective. And it's a theology that takes experiences of disability seriously as a starting point for theological investigation and reflection. So again, like many liberation theologies, there's an idea that our experiences are key for our theological discourse, key to our theological discourse. Now, of course, there are different writers in this field of disability theology who have many different perspectives. Some writers write from the experience of physical disability, some from the experience of chronic illness, which can at times be disabling and other times not. Some writers are parents or carers of people with disabilities and write from that perspective. Others are healthcare professionals who have experience in their professional lives, as well as in their theological reflection, experience of disability in that setting. So the language in this field varies accordingly. And some writers use the word us, meaning people with disabilities, and some writers use the word them, meaning people with disabilities. Now, of course, it's grating when we read a text in disability theology to constantly see people with disabilities referred to as them or they. And sometimes non-disabled authors do this unthinkingly, and it's very unhelpful for our discussion. But at other times, non-disabled writers are using they for people with disabilities in a deliberate attempt to recognize that they don't share the lived experience of disability. And they don't want to assume that they know what this is like. So there's a respect for alterity going on there, which I think it's important to recognize. This is also a good point, this little introductory moment is also a good point to remember that just as the experience of having a disability and the experience of being, for instance, a parent of a child with a disability are very different experiences to each other, so experiences of disability themselves differ hugely from one another. We are not talking here about a homogeneous group, people with disabilities over here that we can easily define, easily point out, easily recognize. There are visible disabilities, there are invisible disabilities. As I was saying before, there are chronic illnesses that bring experience of disabilities that wax and wane. This is a porous group, it's a complex demographic, and it's very hard to make any kind of assumptions at all when discussing this difficult term, people with disabilities. I'm coming to this discussion from an experience of chronic illness, which at times has disabling effects and at other times not. At times I've had medical equipment with me, which makes me very obviously disabled in the eyes of the world. And at times I don't have medical equipment with me. I don't have any telltale markers. It's a very interesting experience because I can gauge how people look at me in the street, whether I do or don't have obvious medical equipment with me. So I'd like us all to bear this in mind, this question of different perspectives in the field, different language used, different experiences, and this porous nature of the group people with disabilities, so that we know that we're not just talking about one lump sum, as it were. Now, what about this language of integrity? We have a very obvious example when we look to the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. It's a very interesting document to just have a look through. If you've never come across it, have a browse, it's online. Article 17, protecting the integrity of the person, says every person with disabilities has a right to respect for his or her physical and mental integrity on an equal basis with others. Here, integrity refers to the wholeness of the person, which points to the problem with that people with disabilities are sometimes not perceived as whole people. They're sometimes perceived as people without personal integrity of their own, or as people in their own right. We could put it in slightly different language. In disability theology, we find people addressing this problem as well. It's not just in the realm of disability activism and that kind of thing. So we have, for example, Hans Reinders, which some of you will have read some of Reinders' work in preparation for this session. So we'll come back to Reinders a little bit later. And the practice of not perceiving people with disabilities as whole people stems in part from the definition of personhood put forward by Peter Singer in the early 90s, which I'm sure some of you will already be familiar with, but it's worth just reminding ourselves of this kind of intellectual baggage that we're bringing into a discussion of disability and integrity. So in 1993, Peter Singer, the utilitarian philosopher, defined personhood as, quote, self-awareness, self-control, to have a sense of self-awareness, self-control, a sense of the future, a sense of the past, the capacity to relate to others and concern for others, communication and curiosity. That's from his Practical Ethics. Singer's book was first published in 1979. This is a reprise in 1993 and instantly became a classic, which is important to note. This is very much a read book. This set the tone for ensuing conversation about personhood, with some espousing Peter's Singer's capacities-based approach and others wanting to dismantle it. So you can see here how Singer sets up a list of criteria. I've got this to-do list on the side of the screen. You know, what can you do? Can you show self-awareness? Can you show self-control? Can you display to me that you have a sense of the future and a sense of the past? We have this tick list. Every human being has to meet the criteria that Singer has set out. If they are to meet the bar, this imagined bar, and be considered as a person. For severely intellectually disabled people, for instance, like the person Kelly that Hans Reinders talks to in the chapter that some people have read for today, this tick list presents a problem. Singer would say that because Kelly can't fulfill the list of tasks he has chosen, she is not a person. We must be careful here to not just assign this point of view to a non-Christian position as well. We have a tradition in Christian thought, notably in Aquinas's writing, because in his writing in the 13th century, he develops this idea that the image of God in humanity can be seen in our rationality. So in a way, Aquinas is saying, well, if you don't display this rationality, you're not enacting, you're not displaying the image of God. This, of course, is a massive problem for disability theology. It's a problem for anyone who doesn't express rationality or show rationality in ways that society thinks of as normal. So instead of thinking about human integrity in terms of a tick list of capacities that we need to be able to display, thinkers in disability theology have chosen to think about humanness, the human person, human integrity in terms of relationality. When it comes to disability theology, we look, for example, to Hans Reinders as an example of this type of thinking. Replacing a capacities approach with a relationality approach. And he says here on the screen, human dignity does not have individual action as its originating source. Kelly's dignity, again, he's referring to this person with extreme intellectual disabilities. Kelly's dignity does not depend on what she is or is not capable of doing. It is a dignity she possesses as a human person with a relational identity. It is a dignity that is communicated to her in the act of people caring about her and about her well-being. If the chaotic force of her natural condition would have had its way, Kelly would have been dead years ago. The dignity is that she has been accepted as God's creature, which is what she shares, that should be shares, sorry, not shared, with all of us. For others to accept her and include her in their relationships is a genuine act of communion. Elsewhere, Reinders suggests that we should think of personhood as, he puts it, relational identity. This reacts against the traditional Western view that the self is an enclosed identity, that we are who we are because of what we possess and are capable of in and of ourselves. Instead, we have this open-faced, outward-looking, relationality-based definition. This is a theological framework which proposes that all people are whole because of their relationality, which is ultimately, for Reinders, upheld by God. He says here that Kelly's dignity has been is that she has been accepted as God's creature. Now we can discuss these more theoretical ideas in the Q&A, but in this lecture, I really wanted to try to focus on some practicalities. When I spoke in this context last year, we did a lot of relationality theology theory, and I thought this time, let's do a bit of a practical focus. So I want to take you into the world of Frances Ryan. Now, of course, those of you who are dialing into this session from outside the UK probably will not have heard of Frances Ryan. She's a Guardian columnist, and she's also a visiting fellow at Manchester Metropolitan University. And she often discusses disability in mainstream media. So for example, in The Guardian, which is a national daily newspaper in Britain. And she's also the author of a book called Crippled, Austerity, and the Demonization of Disabled People, which came out in 2020. In her book and in several of her articles, Ryan is extremely critical of the current social care and benefit system in Britain. For instance, she discusses the way that people with disabilities are labeled in this country as scroungers when they try to access benefits because they're not able to work full time. And just she's critical of how public discourse has been shaped in recent years around people with disabilities. And I wanted to share with you this particular article, which appeared in the Guardian series, Living in a Woman's Body. So in this series of articles, several women journalists, celebrities, Emma Thompson wrote one of these articles in this series, wrote about different experiences of being a woman. Now, of course, for Frances Ryan, she's talking about being a woman with a disability. So this is her article, which I'm going to read for you. It's very short. Living in a woman's body, this body is a genetic mistake, but it is sex, laughter, and beauty too. I also want to apologize in advance for some of the language, but I'm sure you'll be able to take it. And for people who want to follow along reading on the screen instead of listening, I'll be putting the words up on the screen as I read as well. This body is a genetic mistake, a pitiable stare. The scan on a mundane Tuesday lunchtime, with a doctor speaking in hushed tones by the bed. It's glorious too, thanks. It is deep in the bones laughter at 2 a.m. with people who love you. Only strangers care that it is sitting in a wheelchair while doing so. Have you got a license for that thing, sweetheart? It is straight A's, promotions, and beating expectations as much as the odds. It is being buckled over from the pain, clutching a public toilet bowl, pills and dignity rattling at the bottom of a handbag. It is sex, fevered goosebumps and kisses to the skin like magic. It is warm summers with friends, sunshine on bare legs, and 90s dance music ricocheting through the air. It is fucking knackered. This body is more than twice as likely to be domestically abused, is paid on average £3.68 less an hour, is a third less likely to be able to access life-saving breast cancer screenings, and is still told to be grateful for it. Be grateful, love. You're lucky they hired you. He's a saint to be with you. This body is a scrounger if it needs the state, a faker if it holds down a job. It is the reject of capitalist productivity, all the while working harder than any FTSE 100 CEO. This body is 1 in 5, full of potential, untapped and waiting. It is ready to burst to make its mark if only the trains were accessible, personal assistance funded, and housing usable. It is just not trying hard enough. This body is told to love something that hurts every day, #body positivity, or to loathe it, depending on the latest cultural winds. It's too ugly to be on the front of magazines, too pretty to have to be in that chair, love. It's a token out and front and center when it suits, hidden in the back room when it all gets too much. It's more beautiful and powerful and astounding than words can muster. This body is not differently abled or handicapped, and it is not your inspiration either. It is the Herculean sum of all those who came before and those who will after. The young girl wearing her BiPAP machine with pride on TikTok, and the menopausal woman with a stoma choosing knickers and M&S. It's the changing of the seasons over centuries, from being hidden in institutions to regaling on the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, from begging in the workhouse to legislating in Parliament. I believe they call that progress. It is said that the greatest act of resistance is to live well, and I think there is truth in that. It is radical to love a body that the world says is wrong. This body, in all its joy and tears and moving edges, is loved completely, not despite its disability, but because of it. just stay on that slide for a moment. The parts that are in green and underlined are links to other sources. When I put this onto the PowerPoint, the links look as though they might still work. So hopefully if you, I don't know, Jens, if they're allowed to access the slides afterwards, I'm happy to share the slides. You should be able to click through to other pieces of information. So what can we draw from this article if we're thinking theologically about disability? I'm sure we'll all have heard different parts of this speak louder to us than others, and we'll be able to discuss this further in questions afterwards if you'd like to. The things that I hear are this sense of belonging to a community that transcends time, when Ryan refers to this Herculean sum of all those who came before and those who will come after. And I hear the sense of community with those who don't care whether or not she's using a wheelchair. And I also hear the endless chorus of comments that imply that people with disabilities don't deserve the same as non-disabled people. Now, I don't like that language of deserve, but I'm just using it a little bit here. When she quotes other people as saying to her, he's a saint to be with you, you're lucky they hired you. It's interesting that the fact that these comments are there so much that she's integrated them into her text. What does that imply? It implies that a non-disabled person can speak to a disabled person in a way which would not be acceptable if addressed to another non-disabled person. It implies that the person with disabilities is denigrated. Their feelings don't matter. They are trivialized. Their feelings don't matter, the people don't matter. There's trivialization and denigration happening here, for me, in how I read this text. Those are two very important theological ideas to discuss from a theological perspective. And here I want to look to Thomas Reynolds, whose book, it's over here, is really excellent. He wrote this book called Vulnerable Communion, which is a wonderful text. Vulnerable Communion, A Theology of Disability and Hospitality, Thomas Reynolds. And in this book, what he's doing is he's seeking to present a theology of disability, and he aims to review theological questions from a disability perspective. So quite a grand goal here. And in his first chapter, Reynolds discusses how to both avoid theological denigration of disability and as well how to avoid the theological trivialization of disability. Now, I think that these two goals are incredibly important because the denigration of disability and the trivialization of disability, both of these stances denigrate and trivialize people with disabilities themselves. And I contend that both stances are underpinned by this insidious idea that we've already seen, that somehow people with disabilities aren't really persons because they don't really matter in the same way as other people. So why do Christians sometimes fall into the same trap of denigration and trivialization? And what can we do to challenge this way of thinking? Crucially, what can we do when we find some of these same ideas of denigration and trivialization in the biblical text itself? So we now turn to these two questions, denigration and trivialization of disability. And we're going to start with Reynolds' discussion of the theological denigration of disability. Just a note on Reynolds before we continue. So Reynolds is writing from the perspective of as the father of a child with multiple disabilities that affect the areas of cognitive and emotional impairment. So these disabilities have a particularly strong effect on his child's social interactions. So he's really attuned, I suppose, to these social slants of the denigration and trivialization of disability, so that it's helpful to have his own kind of experience in the background here as we read him. So the discussion of denigration of disability, Reynolds notes that the denigration of disability occurs in two ways in the biblical text. He first contends that the Bible denigrates disability by presenting it as a blemish or stigma, signifying a divine punishment or forsakenness. I've put the page numbers in case you want to look at the book later. He gives this example from Exodus 9, which says, for this time, this is God speaking, for this time I will send all my plagues upon you yourself and upon your officials and upon your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But this is why I have let you live, to show you my power and to make my name resound through all the earth. So here the plagues are a punishment to reveal the glory and the power of God, but they're part of God's punishment on Pharaoh and his people. This is the first way that the Bible denigrates disability for Reynolds. Now here it's interesting to see that Nancy Eastland, a leading figure in disability theology, also makes much of the sin disability link in her work, and Reynolds picks up on this when he says further on that the Bible also denigrates disability in the way that he's talking about here by linking healing with forgiveness. And he points us towards John 5:14. After healing the ill man by the pool at Bethzatha, Jesus sees him in the temple after the event and says, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you." This implies a link between sin and disability. So here Reynolds is picking up partly on Iceland's work and partly on this idea that disability is a blemish, is signifying divine punishment. Healing, therefore, linked with forgiveness, kind of reverses the sin and the disability. If you're interested in Nancy Iceland, her wonderful book, The Disabled God, is a really massively influential piece in this area. I can give you the book details later as well, if that's helpful. So the second way in which Reynolds thinks that the Bible denigrates disability, and which I would agree with, is that it does so by suggesting that the disabled person doesn't have enough faith. In the healing narratives, Jesus often declares, "Your faith has made you well." In Mark 10:52, Jesus tells Bartimaeus after healing him from blindness, "Go, your faith has made you well." Of course, this apportions blame and shame on the person with the disability. They're ashamed for not having had enough faith, or they should feel ashamed for not having enough faith, as well as putting the blame squarely on their shoulders as well. It's their fault that they're disabled because they haven't had enough faith. In Reynolds' eyes, this is a distressing theological denigration of disability. Happily, he proposes ways to avoid the theological denigration of disability, which I think it's important to consider. But before we get on to that, I just wanted to say that for Reynolds, both these types of denigration of disability occur because of an assumption of the medical model. And the medical model, it kind of becomes embedded in theological thinking when it comes to disability. Now, I just want to check, is everyone comfortable with this language of the medical model? Shall I perhaps just clarify what that is? I can't see a lot of people on my screen. I'm just going to go ahead and clarify just in case. So there are different models through which people kind of view disability, and perhaps the most famous is the medical model. According to the medical model, there's this bar of normalcy, which a lot of people in disability theology critique. Reynolds, in fact, calls it the cult of normalcy. There's this idea that, yeah, there's this kind of healthy normality that people need to get to, and people who have disabilities are below the bar. But their disability is a problem that needs to be fixed. And if the problem can be fixed, then people will magically reach this bar, right? And in this model, people with disabilities are viewed only kind of individually as medical patients. So firstly, they're not viewed as part of a disability community. They're viewed simply as individuals. And secondly, they're viewed in terms of their disability alone and the kind of problems it poses, rather than viewed as in the wholeness of their lives, and how their disability might not, their impairment, to use Iceland's words, might not actually disable them in some contexts where arrangements have been made to, cater for their particular needs, but then that impairment does disable them in other contexts because their needs haven't been met. But the medical model doesn't talk in those ways. It simply talks about the disability. How do we fix it so that we reach this bar of normalcy? That contrasts, for example, with the minority model. It's also sometimes called the social model. It has several names, but minority model, we can go with that, which views people with disabilities not as just isolated individuals, but instead as part of the disability community. And it also suggests that it's not the disability that is a problem that needs to be fixed, but that it's the world as a whole and society that needs to adapt in order for people's various impairments not to become disabling to them. Does that make sense? Again, I'm not going to get a lot of response. Okay, I've got one thumbs up, so I'm just going to go with that. So for Reynolds, the reason that these types of denigration of disability are occurring is because people are just making this assumption that the medical model is the one that we're going to run with. And that is the approach that we should just have to disability. And he writes that people unwittingly, quote, collapse the distinction between illness and disability, treating the latter as something that can be fixed and cured, gotten rid of, as a case of suffering and inadequacy. So disability is here seen immediately as suffering, as making someone inadequate. There's no discussion with the person with disability to say, does this disability make you suffer? In what ways does it impede you? In what ways can we change the context here so that you're not impeded? Questions like that. And he points to other biblical texts which refute this view of an assumption of the medical model. For instance, he points to Job and says, as Job suffers, his friends call upon him to repent for his hidden sins and alleged arrogance. Yet God ultimately denounces them for speaking wrongly of God. That is, for trying to justify God's ways by presuming to know why Job suffered. Now, of course, as you know, at the end of Job, book of Job, he's referring to Job 42 here. God comes along at the end of the book of Job and kind of says, how dare you question me? Did I not make? And God reels off all the stuff that he's done. How dare you think that you could, understand what I'm doing? And this is really the key for Reynolds. How can we presume that we know why Job is suffering? How do we know? How dare we assume that disability is just a case of suffering and inadequacy? For Reynolds, the denigrating views of disability in the Bible overlook the broader vision of love and hospitality to which the biblical texts bear witness. So another, and again, sorry, before we get to that, I should also add that it's helpful at this point to note that Reynolds, earlier on in his book, talks about his own biblical hermeneutics. So you could say, okay, fine, he wants us to prioritize this broader vision of love and hospitality over this narrative about Jesus and healing this particular person. But Reynolds intentionally does this, writing about his own hermeneutical choices, that a theological hermeneutic of disability involves a careful juxtaposition of texts which are themselves polyphonic and at times contradictory, so as to negotiate theologically between them and discern possible routes for fruitful analysis. So I suppose you could say that Reynolds is taking if you were to compare different types of biblical hermeneutics, he's taking a kind of broad vision, choosing to prioritize messages of love and hospitality over, for example, looking to the sin disability link in some of the healing narratives. But he is doing that with his eyes open, discussing contradiction and just juxtaposition in his own hermeneutical method. And he also, I think, would want to say that this is not a kind of out there biblical hermeneutic, and that there are several other scholars who have blazed that path for him. So to avoid falling into the denigration of disability that could be read in the biblical text, we need to engage in a broader reading of the Bible, argues Reynolds. One in which he says words, sorry, I've just misread my own notes there. In his own words, speak of love and hospitality rather than shame and blame apportioned to people with disabilities. So we looked at the theological denigration of disability. Now let's look at the trivialization of disability. Reynolds writes here, the second main grouping of inadequate representations of disability are those that glibly dismiss the concrete reality of impairment and its personal and social consequences by treating disability in romanticized terms. That is, as a means for non-disabled persons to demonstrate their charity, a theological example from which Christians can learn, or a kind of virtuous suffering. There are thus three primary ways in which disability can be theologically trivialized. If you've read Iceland's text, The Disabled God, which perhaps some of you have, you'll see immediately that he's drawing heavily on Iceland here, and some of the main theological points that she makes in her book, The Disabled God. We can hear echoes of these ideas that non-disabled people can learn from disabled people, and that disabled people are particularly virtuous in the widespread inspiration narratives that surround disabled people, which I'm sure you've come across, but in the UK, a great example is Strictly Come Dancing. I don't know in Canada if there's like a Dancing with the Stars or some kind of similar program where celebrities get paired with professional dancers and they compete in this like televised dance competition. Anyway, over the past several years, there's always been one celebrity participant in Britain's Strictly Come Dancing who has had a disability. Now, I'm kind of divided on this because on the one hand, I think it's brilliant that we finally have a little bit of representation of people with disabilities on mainstream TV. Thank goodness we've waited long enough. However, the problem sometimes spirals into this narrative of, oh, aren't those people inspirational that do Strictly Come Dancing, even though they have a disability? And it's a bit like, well, no, actually, they're just like the other contestants. They're just trying to do well in the competition. That's it, really. They're not amazing, but, they're trying. But you can see often this in all the spin-off media that surround these big shows, there's all these inspirational stories. Frances Ryan refers to this when she says in the article that we just looked at, this body is not differently abled or handicapped, and it is not your inspiration either, which just goes to show how frequently we have this trope coming up of the inspirational person with disabilities. The trivialization of disability forces the reality of living with a disability, for example, the daily task of keeping up with medication, or of cleaning your medical equipment, or of cleaning your mobility, I don't know, wheelchair, crutches, keeping them all greased and well oiled and all the stuff you have to do. It trivializes that lived reality and pushes it into the background. And instead, what gets prioritized is the romanticized visions of the non-disabled viewer. Reynolds references Iceland, and her point in his book, which I haven't put on the slide here, And he references her point that in 2 Corinthians 12:7-10, which is Paul's allusion to the thorn in his flesh, this text can be read as an example of the trivialization of disability. So I am weak, but I am strong, right? Despite my suffering, my problem, I'm overcoming, I can be inspirational. So we have to be really careful how we read these biblical texts. So how can we avoid the theological trivialization of disability? Well, we can integrate concerns for human dignity and human rights with charitable action. These are Reynolds' suggestions. So this first suggestion that he makes would help us counter the portrayal of people with disabilities as an opportunity for charitable action alone. Oh, give to this telethon fundraiser, give to this, help these people. Well, yes, we do need to help each other, but it is more than just charitable action. It is integrating fights for social inclusion and justice alongside helping each other. Secondly, to counter the idea that people with disabilities are just theological examples from which others can learn, Reynolds suggests that we should pay attention to the person with the disability, learn about their real experiences, and not the experiences that others might imagine them to have. Let's not fall into that trap of romanticizing the experience of disability. Let's listen to each other and find out what these experiences are really like. And as I was saying before, this is where we get into the whole world of nuance and diversity within the disability community. And finally, to counter the view that people with disabilities are objectified and in their weakness are examples of virtuous suffering, Reynolds suggests that we recognize that, quote, weakness and suffering do not always yield character virtues, nor do they necessarily produce moral insight for others. Disability is neither a direct cause of suffering nor a concrete sign of weakness. And I think this is a really helpful suggestion to avoid the objectification of people with disabilities, which does happen way too often. If we're able to do all of these three things, we will steadily counter the denigration and the trivialization of disability and of people with disabilities, which opposes the acceptance of wholeness and integrity of people with disabilities. It's clear that the actions that Reynolds offers here rely on being in relation with people with disabilities, and from the people with disabilities perspective, being in relation with people beyond the disability community. Reynolds writes movingly of the pain that this can cause, the pain that's caused by stepping out of the disability community and encountering ableist views and values. And it's extremely tempting, of course, to stay within one's own community where those views won't be aired. But the bridging of the gap has to be done. It has to be done by both sides. Only by being in relation will we be able to overturn the practices of discrimination and trivialization of disability. This is a practical outworking, in a way, what I've presented here, of Rinder's idea that only by being in relation do we all find our personal integrity. For how can we have integrity if we aren't in relation to people who are different to us? Only by this being in relation can we, to come back to Francis Ryan's words here, can we have deep in the bones laughter at 2 a.m. with people who love us. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say, I put my email address here at the bottom. So please do, if you have a question that you don't get to ask right now, please do drop me a line if you'd like to.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks very much, Ali, for this talk. As brilliant as I expected, thank you. So we can go to questions. We have some time for questions. So if you write your questions in the chat box, we'll read them out. And for the speaker to answer.
Got you good.
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. So the first question that has come in says, from one point of view, infants are not yet able, while some people in their old age are no longer able. Is it helpful or allowable to think of all of us somewhere on a spectrum of disability?
That's a great question. Let's just bring back Peter Singer into the room. Peter Singer would say, yeah, they're not really people, those human beings who are infants or who are old and are not, as alert mentally as we would perhaps like them to be. And he and Helga Kuser, they wrote this really inflammatory article, and it's called something really bad like the baby can be killed or something like that. That's not the exact title, but those are the kind of words involved. And they basically say, yeah, infanticide's like okay in some cases. So there is a correlation here between disability discussions and general ability discussions in the population at large. Your question about the spectrum, people within the disability community would answer that really differently. So there's a view that says it's not helpful to just have this everyone's on a spectrum idea, because what that does is it erases the real difficulties that some people with disabilities face in daily life and that other people just have no idea of. The comments that you get, the stares you get, that some people go all the way through their lives without having any idea of what that's like. So for some people, and particularly in disability activism, there's resistance to this everyone's on a scale idea, because it can, to take that second point about trivialization, it can trivialize the experience of disability. However, other thinkers would say it is actually helpful to think about the shared human experience rather than disability. Someone like Deborah Creamer would say the shared human experience of limitation. We're all limited in some way. A great example that Creamer gives as well, we can't all fly. So, that's an experience that we all share, an experience of limitation. So in that sense, by focusing on our shared human limitedness, we can enter into sympathetically into the experience of the person with the disability. So I hope that helps. It's a really divisive discussion, this question of the spectrum.
That's great, thank you very much. The second question came in, how has the mainstream media coverage of the Paralympics affected or contributed to the discourse on disability, in your opinion?
I can only comment on what it's been like in Britain, and I think I have some family in the States, and I generally think that the coverage of the Paralympics is better in the US because they just seem to be more up to date on things like that somehow than Britain. So I don't know enough about the Canadian situation, but in Britain I do feel that we've made a massive leap in the past, really recently, 2 to 4 years, 2 to 5 years maybe. I'm seeing a lot more coverage in mainstream media of the Paralympics, whereas before it was just this thing that people kind of knew happened after the Olympics, but didn't really know what it was. So I think it has greatly improved. I worry that there is still an amount of reporting on it that is very much, look at this inspirational person managing to ski, even though they're blind. And you're like, well, of course they can ski. Like, what are you talking about? So there is still some of this inspirational, some disability activists call it inspiration porn, which I think takes the point across quite well. But to counter what I've just said, there's a lot more serious reporting on it by journalists with disabilities, which is also great, because there's a lot more, not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera, people with disabilities are working on it. So I think it's gradually shifting the mindset, but it's slow.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much. Another question. I wonder if you can comment on the view of disability as diversity / positive identity and belonging to a community / culture. This person is thinking of the affirmation model of disability from a Christian theological perspective.
Yeah, I think that is, again, the disability community is so broad. And I know that that's a view that's incredibly helpful to a lot of people. I think some people with disabilities find it difficult because to them it can deny the pain that they have and the sense of exclusion that they do face in reality, despite also belonging to an affirming community they then face in society, painful interaction. So it can be seen to try to erase those realities. I think theologically, it's great because it reverses this disability as brokenness narrative that we get a lot in theological discourse. So from that perspective, it's extremely helpful and provides a timely challenge to the disability as brokenness discourse.
That's excellent. Kind of on that topic, a follow-up question or a comment perhaps that you might comment on as well. A challenge non-disabled folks often bring up in conversation is that, quote, Jesus healed everyone he encountered. So disability must be a bad thing. It cannot be a positive thing. The idea that all disabled folks should want to be healed, and Christians cannot consider disability to be a good thing that they do not want to get rid of or be healed from. Would you be able to elaborate on some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point because it comes up all the time. If you've ever any experience of disability and you're in a Christian context, you've probably had someone offer to pray for you even when you didn't really feel like it. Oh, just, let me pray for you. No, get off me, So it's really important to, again, keep in mind what Reynolds is talking about this. He didn't use the word mashing up, but that's the word I'm going to use. This mashing up of disability and illness. Disability is not necessarily illness, and it doesn't need to be seen in the same way. Now, some people with disabilities fervently want and pray for a change in their condition. And we need to hear that and support those people who want prayer for that. And in the Christian communities, they're vocal about it, that's what they want. But we mustn't assume that that's what everyone with a disability wants. And if you talk about the resurrection, bodily resurrection, you'll get some people who say, I need to still have my wheelchair in the resurrection because I won't know what to do otherwise. This is kind of who I am, and I don't need to be any different. So again, it's a question that divides, but we certainly, this is part of listening to each other. Listen to the person that you're about to kind of pray on. Do they actually want that? Are they kind of happy with who they are? And maybe they do want prayer, but it's for their relationship with their husband, which is going through a rocky patch, or whatever it happens to be. It's not necessarily prayer for the disability that they want.
Excellent, thank you very much. There was a technical question or just a quick one. Who was the author you mentioned regarding disability as shared human limitation?
Deborah Creamer, which is spelled like cream with ER, first name Deborah. She wrote a book whose title I think is it Embodying Limits? It's got embodiment or embodying in the title, and it's got limit or limitation in the title. Embracing a Theology of Limits, something like that. You can Google it, Deborah Creamer.
Well, that's great, thanks. And then the last question that we received is, I noticed that you used intellectual disabilities rather than learning disabilities. But doesn't that play into the hands of those who use rationality as a measure of personhood or dignity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe I need to revise my vocabulary. I think I'm using intellectual disabilities as a differentiator to physical disability. I think maybe developmental disability is better than intellectual disability on reflection. Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm going to go in and think about that.
Excellent.
Last one.
Last question. Okay, this is the last one. Can you comment on disability being given to people throughout the Bible? For example, Paul being gifted or punished with blindness for a time. Usually it is framed as a sort of punishment, but if you could comment.
Yeah. It's the sin disability link. There you go. You did this wrong, have a disability for a bit. I mean, we can't get away from the fact that this link is there in the biblical text. It's awfully troublesome. My view is that we need to, I would be with Reynolds on this, that it's troubling, and there's not much we can do about it apart from look at a broad message of scripture and kind of be thankful that we finally moved away from that view, or at least we have other options. But the Bible can be a really dangerous text for people with disabilities. It can be a dangerous text for women. We can talk about that another time. But it's a dangerous text for people with disabilities.
Okay, thank you very much for all of your questions and for your answers, Ellie. I'd like to squeeze in one more, but we've been so rudely cut off the last time by the electronic overlords that I'm not going to risk that again. So I just, for the public portion, it just remains to, again, thank you so much. You've given us lots to think about, hopefully something to change our minds about, and we will end the public portion here and meet with you again in 10 minutes. Or yeah, 10 minutes, 10 after 1 with the class. So thank you all. And for all you out there, we're taking a week's break for reading break, and then the next lecture will be following that, but you'll get a notice, I'm sure. Thanks very much for attending.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.